Mogadishu, Somalia, 6 months ago. The door exploded inward with a crack that split the night like thunder, wood splinters pirouetting through smoke-choked air as Commander Elena Hayes crossed the threshold into hell. Her SEAL Team 5 operators stacked behind her in perfect formation, weapons up, night vision, painting the world in shades of green death. The compound should have been clear. That's what the Marine Force Recon Intel had promised. One target, minimal security, a clean snatch and grab that would put a high-value terrorist in a black site interrogation room before sunrise. The intel was wrong. 12 hostiles materialized from the shadows like jinns summoned from nightmare muzzle flashes, strobing the darkness into a hellish disco of violence. The first burst caught Lieutenant David Ramirez in the doorway, Elena's best friend since Bud's training, the man who'd pulled her through Hell Week when hypothermia had her seeing things that weren't there. He went down hard, his body armor no match for the 7.62 rounds that punched through Kevlar and bone and life itself. Elena returned fire on instinct, her HK-416 barking controlled pairs into center mass, dropping 2 hostiles before her conscious mind even registered what was happening. Behind her, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb took rounds to the throat and chest, his death rattle a wet gurgle that would haunt her dreams for months. Petty Officer First Class Sarah Chen. No relation to anyone in this story, just another warrior who died because Marines couldn't be bothered to verify their fucking intelligence, caught a round through her left eye, dead before gravity claimed her. The firefight lasted 93 seconds. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in Elena's ears faded to a dull roar, 3 of her operators were cooling on blood-slicked concrete, while the rest secured a compound that should have been manageable, but had instead become a slaughterhouse. The HVT escaped through a tunnel system that wasn't on any map the Marines had provided. The weapons cache they'd been warned about turned out to be enough ordnance to level a city block. Elena knelt beside Ramirez's body, his blood still warm as it soaked through her gloves. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and she reached out with trembling fingers to close them. "I'm sorry, David," she whispered. "I'm so goddamn sorry." But sorry wouldn't bring him back. Sorry wouldn't explain to his wife and 2 daughters why Daddy wasn't coming home. Sorry wouldn't change the fact that Marine Force Recon's institutional arrogance, their assumption that they knew better, their dismissal of contradictory intelligence from local sources they deemed unreliable, had killed 3 of the finest operators America had ever produced. The after-action report would be sanitized, classified, buried under enough red tape to choke a bureaucrat. But Elena would remember. She would carry those deaths like stones in her chest, and she would make damn sure that the culture that had killed her friends would face a reckoning. Camp Pendleton, California, present day. The fluorescent lights of Mess Hall, Charlie buzzed with the persistence of angry wasps casting their harsh institutional glare across rows of metal tables where 37 Marines hunched over evening chow like kings surveying conquered territory. The air was thick with the smell of industrial meatloaf, the particular musk of men who believed they owned every square inch of ground they walked on, and the acrid bite of testosterone-fueled arrogance that had been fermenting in this unit for longer than anyone cared to admit. At the center table, surrounded by his court of sycophants and true believers, sat Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane. At 34, he was what happened when you took a recruiting poster and gave it just enough life to be dangerous. Square jaw that could have been chiseled from granite. Shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of democracy itself, or at least the delusion that he represented its finest expression. Eyes like chips of flint, hard and cold, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. His uniform was pressed to parade ground perfection, boots polished to a mirror, shine his bearing that of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with superior firepower and unwavering conviction. The Marines around him hung on his every word like it was gospel handed down from Chesty Puller himself. Kane commanded Bravo Company's Force Recon Unit, and if you listened to him tell it, which everyone did because nobody was stupid enough to interrupt, they were the tip of the spear, the sharp edge of American military, might the finest warriors this great nation could forge from raw clay and determination and the kind of brutal training that separated the men from the boys. They'd completed tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. They'd earned their combat ribbons the hard way, through firefights and roadside bombs and the peculiar hell of counterinsurgency warfare, where the enemy looked like everyone else until the moment they tried to kill you. They'd returned home with the swagger that only came from surviving hell and living to tell war stories that got better with each retelling and each beer. But look closer. Look past the polished surface and practiced bravado, and you'd see the hairline fractures spreading through the foundation. Kane's hands tremored slightly when he thought nobody was watching a tremor that could have been too much coffee or something considerably stronger. His eyes were bloodshot, whether from exhaustion or the bottle he kept in his footlocker was anyone's guess. Most telling of all, there was a desperate edge to his confidence, the kind that came from a man who knew his glory days were behind him and was terrified of sliding into irrelevance. To his right sat Corporal Garrett Huxley, 26 years old, but carrying himself like he owned the world and was considering expansion plans. Built like a linebacker with hands the size of dinner plates, he was the unit's self-appointed enforcer, the one they called when someone needed an attitude adjustment delivered with maximum prejudice. His knuckles bore the permanent discoloration of a man who'd settled too many arguments with violence, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Those eyes were pale blue, cold as Arctic water, and about as sympathetic. Huxley had washed out of Ranger School twice, not for lack of physical capability, but because he couldn't follow orders from anyone he didn't respect. That failure had calcified into a resentment he wore like a badge of honor, a chip on his shoulder the size of Texas. He'd learned to channel that resentment into being the biggest, baddest son of a bitch in any room he entered, and so far, that strategy had served him well enough. Across from Huxley sat Lance Corporal Wyatt Brennan, 23, and hungry for acceptance in a way that made him dangerous. He was lean where Huxley was thick, quick where the others were methodical, smart where they were strong. The unit's communications specialist could make dead radios sing and had a mind sharp enough to have earned a full scholarship to Stanford, which he turned down to enlist because he wanted to prove himself where it really mattered. His need for validation made him eager to please, willing to cross lines others might hesitate at, desperate to belong to something bigger than himself. Completing their inner circle was Private First Class Liam Thornton, the youngest at 22, still carrying that desperate hunger of a man trying to prove he belonged. Fresh out of advanced infantry training with scores high enough to write his own ticket, he'd requested assignment to Bravo Company, specifically because of their reputation. He stood at attention even while sitting his back ramrod straight, his eyes constantly scanning for approval from the older Marines. In his mind, earning their respect was the key to everything promotion recognition belonging to something that mattered. The mess hall operated on unwritten rules as rigid as any military regulation. Officers sat separately from enlisted. Senior NCOs commanded the prime real estate near the windows where they could see and be seen. Junior Marines filled in the spaces left behind, grateful for whatever scraps of recognition filtered down from above. Women, the few who were stationed at Camp Pendleton, kept to their own corner, a safety measure born of bitter experience with Marines who saw them as invaders in their sacred brotherhood. Tonight felt different, though. Word had been circulating through the grapevine like wildfire through dry brush that changes were coming to their corner of military paradise. Budget cuts, personnel transfers, maybe even unit reorganizations that could scatter Kane's carefully cultivated kingdom to the four winds. The tension was thick enough to cut with a Ka bar, and everyone was looking for someone to blame, someone to take their frustrations out on some convenient target to remind themselves that they were still the apex predators in this particular food chain. Kane leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, holding court like a king who sensed rebellion brewing in the provinces. "I'm telling you," he said, his voice pitched to carry to the surrounding tables. "These budget cuts are going to separate the wheat from the chaff. Units that can't hack it are going to get folded into larger commands or disbanded entirely. It's natural selection, Darwin, and digital camo. Survival of the fittest." Huxley agreed, his grin all teeth and no warmth. "Good. About time they cut the dead weight. Too many soft units getting by on participation trophies and sensitivity training." Brennan nodded enthusiastically, pulling out his phone to capture the moment for his Instagram followers. He had a modest following of military enthusiasts who ate up his behind-the-scenes glimpses of Force Recon life. "Force Recon owns this base," he said, framing the shot to capture Kane's table in all its glory. "Always have, always will." Thornton laughed a little too hard at a joke he didn't quite understand, desperate to be included in the moment. His phone buzzed with a notification, something about a classified evaluation team arriving next week, but he dismissed it without reading. Whatever pencil-pushing desk jockey the Pentagon was sending to check boxes and justify their existence, Bravo Company would handle them the same way they handled every other outsider who thought they could judge warriors from behind a keyboard. Kane caught the notification on his own phone and snorted with derision. Speak of the devil, some Pentagon babysitter is coming next week to evaluate inter-service cooperation. Probably some admiral's kid getting the grand tour before daddy retires. He took a long pull from his water bottle, and the slight tremor in his hand made the liquid slosh against the sides. We'll bury them in paperwork and doctrine until they beg to go back to their air-conditioned offices. The conversation drifted to cruder topics. Complaints about new regulations that actually expected them to treat female personnel like human beings. Speculation about upcoming deployments to somewhere hot and sandy where they could finally get back to real soldiering. The kind of locker room talk that seemed harmless until you realized it was a symptom of something much deeper and more toxic. None of them noticed when she walked in. 1920 hours. The woman who entered mess hall. Charlie moved with an economy of motion that spoke of absolute confidence in her environment. She was maybe 5'7" athletic build, visible even under the loose-fitting Navy utility uniform she wore. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation ponytail that caught the fluorescent light like copper wire, and her green eyes swept the room with the kind of systematic assessment that came from years of reading hostile environments for threats and opportunities. She carried a simple metal tray and moved toward the serving line like she belonged there, like she had every right to share their space, like she was utterly oblivious to the fact that she just walked into a den of lions who weren't accustomed to uninvited guests. She wore no visible rank insignia. Her uniform was Navy issue, but the patches had been removed, leaving only faint outlines where they'd once been attached. To the casual observer, and every Marine in that mess hall was a casual observer, at best she looked like a civilian contractor, maybe a Pentagon liaison, possibly even a reporter doing a story on military life. Someone temporary. Someone who didn't matter. Someone who definitely didn't belong in their sacred space. But tucked under her arm, visible for just a moment as she shifted her tray, was a slim leather folder with classification markings that would have raised alarms if anyone had bothered to look closely. They didn't. They were too busy making assumptions. Kane noticed her first, his eyes narrowing as he took in her presence with the predatory attention of a shark scenting blood in the water. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and watched her move through the serving line with the kind of cold assessment that made smart people nervous and stupid people combative. The woman seemed oblivious to his scrutiny, focused on the simple task of getting food and finding a place to eat. She ordered whatever was fast fuel, not enjoyment, and accepted her tray with a nod of thanks to the mess staff that was more than most Marines bothered with. Well, well, Kane said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard at the surrounding tables, but not quite loud enough to be called out. Looks like we've got ourselves a lost little lamb. Huxley followed his sergeant's gaze and grinned, the expression holding all the warmth of a shark sizing up a seal. Pentagon sent us a babysitter, Sarge. Someone to make sure we're playing nice with our toys and using our inside voices. The woman found an empty table in the corner. The table the female Marines usually claimed when they had no choice but to eat in the main mess, and sat down alone. Her choice of position was interesting if anyone had been paying attention to such things. Back to the wall, clear sight lines to all three entrances, unobstructed view of the entire room. She began eating with the methodical efficiency of someone who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure, but one hand remained free, resting on the table within easy reach of the small notebook she'd pulled from her pocket. She seemed completely unaware of the attention she was drawing. The way conversations stopped at nearby tables, the way Marines were beginning to turn in their chairs to get a better look at the intruder who'd wandered into their territory without invitation or apparent awareness of the social order she was violating. Brennan leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried in the suddenly quieter mess hall. $20 says she's some admiral's daughter getting the grand tour. Daddy wants to show her where real military happens before he retires to some defense contractor job. 50 says she's a social worker, Thornton added, his young face flushed with the excitement of being included in the speculation. Here to investigate hazing complaints or some sensitivity training violation. Probably read some reports about our unit culture and decided we need re-education. Kane's smile was cold and calculating. In his mind, this was an opportunity, a chance to reassert the natural order, to remind everyone present that this was his domain and outsiders weren't welcome. More importantly, it was a chance to demonstrate to his Marines that he was still the alpha, still the man they should fear and respect above all others, still relevant in a world that seemed increasingly designed to make men like him obsolete. The stage was set. The hierarchy was established. The players were in position. None of them had any idea that the quiet woman eating alone in the corner had more combat experience than their entire unit combined. That her kill count included high-value targets they'd only heard whispered about in classified intelligence briefings. That she could end any three of them without breaking a sweat or raising her heart rate above resting. They were about to learn that assumptions could be more dangerous than enemy fire, and Corporal Garrett Huxley was about to make the biggest mistake of his military career. What none of them could see, what they were fundamentally incapable of seeing because it contradicted every assumption they'd built their identities around, was that Elena Hayes was conducting an evaluation that had already begun the moment she'd walked through those doors. Every failure to challenge her credentials was noted. Every crude joke that carried to her corner was cataloged. Every instance of toxic posturing was documented in the small government-issue notebook she seemed to be using for nothing more important than doodling. But she wasn't doodling. She was sketching the floor layout with professional precision, marking sight lines and cover positions and fields of fire with the practiced hand of someone who'd done this in environments where mistakes meant body bags. She was documenting the way power flowed through the room, the subtle hierarchies and dominance displays, the way certain Marines commanded attention, while others faded into the background. She was building a case piece by piece, observation by observation. And Bravo Company was failing every test she'd set before them without even realizing they were being tested. Elena had walked into hostile territory before. Fallujah safe houses where insurgents waited behind every door with fingers on triggers and hatred in their hearts. Afghan mountain caves where Taliban fighters had the high ground and home field advantage. Syrian compounds where one wrong step meant death for her entire team and failure of missions that had taken months to plan. But none of those environments had prepared her for the peculiar brand of toxicity that permeated Mess Hall Charlie at 1900 hours on a Tuesday evening. This wasn't the honest danger of men who wanted to kill you because you represented an invading army. This was something more insidious, the casual cruelty of men who'd convinced themselves that their worst impulses were actually virtues, that their biases were just hard-earned wisdom, that their contempt for anyone different was simply realistic assessment of capability. She'd arrived at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton 3 hours earlier, her orders sealed and her mission classified at levels that would make most of these jarheads' security clearances look like library cards. The official story was simple joint training exercise, inter-service cooperation, Navy-Marine Corps integration, standard bureaucratic nonsense that would bore them into compliance. The reality was considerably more complex and infinitely more dangerous. But that wasn't something these Marines needed to know. Not yet. Elena had requested this assignment specifically against the advice of her superiors, who'd warned her that Marines didn't play well with outsiders, especially outsiders who happened to be female Navy, in carrying enough classified intelligence to end careers with a single phone call. But she'd insisted, and when a SEAL Team 5 commander insisted on something, admirals tended to listen. She had her reasons, good reasons that went back 6 months to an operation in Somalia that had gone sideways because Marine intelligence had been compromised by the same kind of institutional arrogance she was witnessing right now. The same dismissal of contradictory information because it came from sources they deemed unreliable. The same absolute certainty that they knew better, knew everything, couldn't possibly be wrong. That arrogance had killed Lieutenant David Ramirez. It had killed Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb. It had killed Petty Officer First Class Sarah Chen. 3 of the finest operators Elena had ever served with, cut down not by superior enemy force, but by friendly incompetence dressed up as confidence. Her uniform bore no rank insignia by design. The mission required her to assess unit cohesion, leadership effectiveness, and operational readiness without the artificial deference that came with visible rank. She needed to see these Marines as they really were, not as they pretended to be when brass was watching. She needed to document their institutional culture in its natural habitat, unfiltered and undisguised. The early results were not encouraging. She'd chosen this table deliberately. Good sight lines to all entrances back to the wall, clear fields of fire if things went kinetic. Old habits from a decade of operations where complacency killed and situational awareness meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. The metal chair was uncomfortable, the lighting harsh, but she'd endured worse. Much worse. The food was exactly what she'd expected from a military facility. Institutional, functional design more for caloric content than palatability. She ate with mechanical efficiency, one eye on her meal, and one on the room's dynamics, building her mental map of this unit's power structure, with the same systematic attention she'd used to map an enemy compound. Staff Sergeant Kane's table was clearly the apex of the local food chain. The way other Marines glanced over seeking approval or acknowledgement marked him as the unofficial king of this particular castle. His body language screamed confidence, but Elena's trained eye caught the micro-tells that suggested a man under pressure. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted toward the entrance every time someone new arrived, the tension in his jaw that spoke of grinding teeth and sleepless nights. Corporal Huxley was easier to read, a classic alpha personality with impulse control issues and an authority complex large enough to have its own gravitational field. She'd seen his type before in every branch of service. Competent enough to be dangerous, insecure enough to overcompensate, and stupid enough to mistake aggression for strength. The way he kept glancing in her direction suggested he was already formulating some kind of challenge, testing boundaries he didn't realize existed. The younger Marines, Brennan and Thornton, were followers, pack animals looking for a strong leader to validate their place in the hierarchy. Dangerous in their own way because their need for acceptance would make them willing participants in whatever stupidity their seniors conceived. She'd seen good soldiers do terrible things simply because they wanted to belong, wanted to be part of the tribe, wanted to prove they were hard enough to run with the big dogs. What troubled her most was the complete absence of professional curiosity. Not one of these Marines had approached her, introduced himself, or made any attempt to determine her purpose on their base. Basic security protocol demanded that unidentified personnel be challenged, credentials verified, authority established. It was Security 101, the kind of thing they should have learned in boot camp and reinforced through years of training. Instead, they'd made assumptions based on her gender, an apparent lack of visible rank, then proceeded to ignore her as irrelevant. It was exactly the kind of institutional blindness that had gotten Marines killed in Somalia. The same dismissal of threats that didn't fit their preconceived notions. The same arrogant certainty that they could assess situations at a glance without bothering with the tedious work of actual verification. Elena finished her meal and checked her watch. 1927 hours. She had a briefing with the base commander at 2100, which gave her another hour and 33 minutes to complete her initial assessment. So far, the picture wasn't pretty. Sloppy security awareness, poor discipline, leadership that seemed more concerned with maintaining social dominance than military effectiveness. She pulled out her notebook again and began making discrete observations, not about what she was seeing, but about what she wasn't seeing. No senior NCOs visible in the mess hall during prime dinner hours. No officers mixing with enlisted personnel to take the temperature of their units. No evidence of the kind of cohesion that marked elite military formations, just cliques and posturing, and the kind of toxic masculinity that turned warriors into playground bullies. The conversation at Kane's table was getting louder, more animated. She caught fragments through the ambient noise complaints about new regulations, speculation about upcoming deployments, crude jokes about female personnel. Standard barracks talk, but delivered with an edge that suggested these men felt entitled to their opinions and unconcerned about who might be listening. Huxley's voice carried particularly well, probably by design. He was the type who needed an audience for his performance validation for his dominance. "I'm telling you," he said, his voice pitched to carry, "these diversity initiatives are going to get people killed. You can't lower standards just to make politicians feel good about themselves. Combat doesn't care about your gender or your feelings. It cares about whether you can carry your weight and pull your trigger when shit gets real." Murmurs of agreement rippled through his audience. Brennan nodded enthusiastically, his phone still out, and recording capturing this moment of truth-telling for his followers. Thornton looked slightly uncomfortable, but said nothing, unwilling to break ranks over something as trivial as basic human decency. Cain leaned back with the satisfied expression of a man watching his disciples spread his gospel. Standards are standards for a reason, he added, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The moment you start compromising them, you're not helping anyone. You're just getting people killed to serve some political agenda. Elena continued eating, continued taking notes, continued cataloging the dozens of ways these Marines were failing basic professional standards. She'd seen this movie before, knew how it ended. The only question was whether she'd need to accelerate the timeline or let their natural stupidity run its course. That's when Corporal Garrett Huxley made his first tactical error. He stood up from his table, ostensibly to clear his tray, but his path took him directly past Elena's corner table. Not a coincidence. The serving line and disposal area were in the opposite direction. This was a deliberate maneuver, a probing action designed to test her reaction and establish his dominance of the space. Elena didn't look up from her notebook, didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't give him the confrontation he was clearly seeking. In her experience, men like Huxley escalated when ignored, revealed their true nature when they thought nobody important was watching. She was about to give him all the rope he needed to hang himself. Huxley paused beside her table, close enough that his shadow fell across her notes. Still, she didn't react. Just continued writing in the small, precise handwriting that had filled dozens of after-action reports over the years. Her pen moved across the page in smooth, controlled strokes. Subject demonstrates predatory approach pattern, testing boundaries, seeking confrontation, classic dominance behavior consistent with insecure authority complex. "Excuse me, ma'am," Huxley said, his tone superficially polite, but carrying an undertone of condescension thick enough to choke on. "I don't think we've been introduced." Elena looked up, meeting his eyes with the kind of level stare that had made insurgent leaders reconsider their life choices. Her gaze was calm, professional, utterly devoid of the nervousness or deference he'd been expecting. Those green eyes held depths that should have warned him he was making a terrible mistake. But Huxley had never been particularly good at reading warning signs. "No," she said simply, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard, but not loud enough to draw additional attention. "We haven't." The silence stretched out between them, filled with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Huxley had expected elaboration, explanation, the kind of nervous chatter that uncertain people use to fill uncomfortable spaces. Instead, he got nothing. Just those green eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed facade to the scared, insecure man beneath. "I'm Corporal Huxley," he said, extending his hand with the kind of forced friendliness that was really just another form of aggression. "Bravo Company Force Recon. And you are?" Elena looked at his outstretched hand for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be noticeable, short enough to avoid outright rudeness, then returned to her notebook without accepting the gesture. "Busy," she said, and the single word carried more dismissal than an entire paragraph of explanation could have conveyed. The word hit Huxley like a physical blow. Around the mess hall, conversations had stopped as Marines tuned into the drama playing out in the corner. Phones appeared as word spread through the modern military's most efficient communication network, social media. This was going to be all over base within an hour, probably all over the Corps within a day, and everyone wanted to be able to say they'd witnessed it firsthand. This wasn't how these encounters were supposed to go. Huxley was Force Recon. He was Alpha. He was supposed to command respect and deference, not get dismissed like some boot private who'd forgotten his place. His face flushed red above his collar, and Elena could see the moment his rational mind yielded to his emotional need for dominance. This was where it would start. The first step in a chain of escalating stupidity that would ultimately reveal everything she needed to know about this unit's fitness for classified operations. The moment where training should have overridden ego, where professional discipline should have reasserted control, where a smart man would have recognized danger and backed away. But Garrett Huxley had never been accused of being smart. "Look, lady," he said, his voice dropping to a register meant to be threatening, the kind of tone that had worked on civilians and contractors and junior personnel who understood their place in the food chain. "I don't know who you are or why you're here, but this is a Marine facility. We have protocols, procedures, ways of doing things. Maybe you're lost. Maybe you're in the wrong building. Maybe you need an escort back to wherever you're supposed to be." Elena finished writing her sentence, Subject escalates to verbal intimidation when social dominance challenged. Predicted behavior pattern confirmed. Capped her pen with deliberate precision and looked up at him again. This time her expression held a hint of amusement, the kind of patient tolerance you might show a particularly slow child who was trying very hard but still missing the point entirely. "Corporal," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard at the surrounding tables. "Do you always introduce yourself to visitors by assuming they're lost and offering to escort them off base?" It was a perfect trap, beautifully constructed with the precision of someone who'd spent years manipulating human psychology in environments where failure meant death. If he backed down now, he'd look weak in front of his audience, his carefully cultivated reputation for dominance shattered by a woman who wouldn't even shake his hand. If he escalated, he'd be taking action against an unidentified individual without proper authority or justification, a violation of the protocols he just claimed to care about. Either choice would reveal critical information about his judgment, his training, and his fitness for leadership. Either choice would add another brick to the case Elena was building against this unit's continued existence. Corporal Garrett Huxley chose escalation. His hand moved towards her shoulder, ostensibly to guide her to her feet, actually to establish physical dominance through uninvited contact. It was a move that had worked for him before with civilians who didn't know any better, with contractors who couldn't afford to make waves, with junior personnel who understood the unwritten rule that you didn't challenge senior Marines even when they were wrong. He had no idea that the woman sitting quietly in the corner had spent the last 10 years perfecting the art of violence, that her hands were classified as lethal weapons by 3 different government agencies, that her reflexes had been honed in environments where hesitation measured in milliseconds meant the difference between life and death, that touching her without permission was about to become the most expensive mistake of his military career. Elena's eyes went cold, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, that Garrett Huxley's survival instincts registered, but his conscious mind dismissed. He caught a glimpse of something that made every alarm bell in his primitive hindbrain start screaming warnings his pride refused to hear. The collision was about to begin, and it would be over before most people in that mess hall even realized something had happened. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but every Marine in mess hall, Charlie, would remember it for the rest of their lives with the kind of crystal clarity usually reserved for car crashes and combat engagements. It would be dissected, analyzed, replayed in their minds during sleepless nights when they wondered how they'd been so catastrophically wrong about so many things. Corporal Garrett Huxley's hand was 6 inches from Elena's shoulder when the world shifted on its axis and taught him the difference between confidence and competence. Elena didn't move like other people moved. There was no wasted motion, no telegraphed intention, no warning signs that her body was about to become a weapon. One moment she was sitting quietly with her notebook, the next she was flowing upward like water, taking the shape of violence. Her left hand intercepted Huxley's wrist with surgical precision, fingers finding the pressure point where the radial nerve surfaced just below his thumb joint. The contact lasted exactly 1 second, long enough to send white-hot agony shooting up his arm like molten copper through his veins, not long enough for him to process what was happening or mount any kind of defense. But that wasn't the lesson. The lesson came when Huxley tried to pull back, tried to reassert his physical dominance through superior size and strength. Elena let him pull and encouraged it, even using his own momentum against him in a way that turned his retreat into forward motion he couldn't control. Her right hand appeared at his elbow, not grabbing, just guiding, redirecting his energy along vectors that his body understood, but his brain couldn't comprehend. Physics took over with the inexorable certainty of gravity. Huxley's center of gravity shifted forward, his weight committed to a direction he hadn't chosen, his 220 pounds of Marine Corps muscle suddenly as helpless as a child's toy in the hands of someone who understood leverage and anatomy and the beautiful simplicity of applied force. Elena stepped aside like a matador avoiding a bull, and suddenly Garrett Huxley was airborne. His trajectory carried him past her table and toward the concrete floor with all the grace of a falling refrigerator. The timing was perfect, the execution flawless, the result inevitable. He hit hard, shoulder first, absorbing the initial impact with muscle and bone that would bruise spectacularly by morning. Then his hip, the joint protesting with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the suddenly silent mess hall. Finally, the side of his face, his cheek meeting unforgiving concrete, in a sequence that sounded like someone dropping a sack of potatoes from a significant height. The silence that followed was absolute. 37 Marines sat frozen in their chairs, forks halfway to their mouths, conversations interrupted mid-syllable, every eye locked on the impossible sight before them. Garrett Huxley, 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds, of force recon muscle and attitude sprawled on the floor like a discarded puppet, while a woman who couldn't weigh more than 140 stood over him like she'd just swatted a mosquito. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their clattering to stare through the serving window at the scene unfolding in their mess hall. This wasn't supposed to happen. This violated every assumption about how the world worked, about who had power and who didn't, about what was possible when size and gender and institutional authority collided with actual competence. Huxley rolled onto his back, blinking stars out of his vision, his right arm hanging useless at his side. The nerve strike had been precisely calculated, painful enough to disable, not quite severe enough to cause permanent damage. Professional courtesy from someone who understood the difference between teaching and destroying. He tried to push himself up with his left hand, failed, tried again. His face was a mask of shock and humiliation and dawning rage. "What the hell?" he started to say, but his voice came out wrong, cracked and uncertain. "Physics," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. She hadn't even sat back down, just stood beside her table with the same relaxed posture she'd maintained throughout the entire encounter. "Action, reaction. You grabbed, I redirected. Basic Newtonian mechanics." She looked down at him with the kind of patient expression usually reserved for particularly slow students struggling with a simple concept. "Also personal space, Corporal. Generally speaking, you don't touch people without permission, especially people you don't know, especially when those people are sitting quietly eating their dinner, minding their own business." Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane was on his feet now, his chair scraping backward with enough force to tip it over. His face had gone through several interesting color changes, pale to red to purple, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The careful control he'd maintained over his domain was cracking like ice in a spring thaw. "Who the hell do you think you are?" His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience, the kind of barely controlled fury that made smart Marines find somewhere else to be. "You just assaulted one of my Marines." Elena turned to face him, and Kane got his first good look at those green eyes. They were calm, professional, completely unmoved by his display of authority. It was like staring into the eyes of a shark, not malevolent, just utterly indifferent to anything that wasn't prey. "Your Marine assaulted me, Sergeant," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather or the quality of the meatloaf. "I defended myself using the minimum force necessary to terminate unwanted physical contact." That's textbook self-defense doctrine covered in Section 4 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I can cite the specific statute if you'd like. She paused, letting that sink in. Around the mess hall, Marines were beginning to murmur among themselves, phones appearing, as word spread through the modern military's most efficient communication network. This was going to be all over base within an hour, probably all over the Corps within a day, and everyone wanted their piece of the story. Unless, Elena continued, her voice still carrying that same conversational tone that somehow made her words more devastating than any shout could have been, "You're suggesting that your Marines should be permitted to grab female personnel without consequence. Is that standard operating procedure for Bravo Company, Sergeant Kane?" The question hung in the air like a live grenade with the pin pulled. Kane's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He was caught between contradictory imperatives: defend his Marine versus avoid a sexual harassment investigation that would end his career faster than a dishonorable discharge. The smart play was to de-escalate, apologize for the misunderstanding, move on with whatever dignity he could salvage. But Marcus Kane hadn't made Staff Sergeant by being smart. He'd made it by being tough, by never backing down, by establishing dominance through sheer force of personality and the willingness to escalate beyond what any sane person would consider reasonable. And toughness in his worldview demanded a response. "Lady," he said, and the word dripped with contempt, "I don't know what kind of games you think you're playing, but this is a Marine Corps facility. We have procedures here. Protocols. You can't just what?" Elena's voice remained level, conversational, the kind of tone that made people lean in to hear better. can't just sit in your mess hall, can't just eat a meal, can't just exist in a space you've decided belongs exclusively to you and people who look like you. Huxley was back on his feet now, cradling his right arm against his chest like a wounded bird. His face was flushed with embarrassment and fury, his breathing rapid and shallow. The fall had rattled him more than just physically. It had shattered his self-image as an alpha predator and replaced it with the humiliating reality of being prey. "You sucker punched me," he said, his voice tight with pain and wounded pride. "That was a cheap shot, a fluke. You got lucky because I wasn't expecting—" "Corporal," Elena interrupted, and her smile was winter cold. "If I wanted to sucker punch you, you'd still be unconscious. What you experienced was a compliance technique designed to disengage unwanted physical contact. It's the same move they teach to elementary school children in anti-bullying programs. The fact that it worked on you says more about your training than mine." The comparison to elementary school children was calculated, deliberate, designed to probe just how far Huxley's ego would let him fall before common sense reasserted itself. The answer apparently was much farther than anyone had expected. "Compliance technique." Huxley's laugh was ugly bitter, the sound of a man watching his reputation circle the drain. "You think you're some kind of martial arts expert? You think one lucky move makes you tough?" He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, settled into a fighting stance that would have been intimidating if Elena hadn't already demonstrated her ability to take him apart like a cheap watch. Around the mess hall, Marines were pulling out their phones, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be worth recording for posterity. "Tell you what, lady," Huxley continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, playing to his audience, because that was all he had left. "You apologize for that cheap shot, and I'll forget this ever happened. We'll call it a misunderstanding. No harm, no foul. You can go back to whatever Pentagon desk you crawled out from under, and we can all move on with our lives." Elena looked at him with the kind of clinical interest a biologist might show an interesting specimen under a microscope. "And if I don't apologize?" Huxley's grin was all teeth and no warmth, the expression of a predator that had forgotten it was no longer at the top of the food chain. "Then maybe you need to learn some respect. For Marines in general and me in particular." It was a threat, clear, unambiguous, delivered in front of 36 witnesses with their phones out and recording. Elena cataloged it, filed it away with all the other evidence she was accumulating about this unit's fitness for classified operations. The picture wasn't getting any prettier. "Corporal," she said, and her voice carried the kind of matter-of-fact calm that made smart people nervous and stupid people furious. "Are you challenging me to a fight?" The question was asked with such clinical detachment that it took a moment for its implications to sink in. Huxley's bravado faltered slightly as his tactical brain finally came online and started calculating odds. She'd already put him on the floor once without apparent effort. She was smaller, lighter, presumably weaker by every conventional metric, but something about the way she stood, relaxed but ready, calm but alert, suggested that conventional assumptions might not apply. "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, some survival instinct finally asserting itself through the fog of wounded pride, "that maybe you bit off more than you can chew. That maybe you're used to intimidating desk jockeys and paper pushers, and you figured you'd come slum it with the real military to see how the other half lives." Elena nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering his assessment. "I see. So to be clear, you grabbed me without permission. I extracted myself using minimal force. And now you want to escalate to an actual physical confrontation because your feelings are hurt." Put that way, it sounded exactly as stupid as it was. Huxley's face darkened further, but he'd committed too much pride to back down now. Around the mess hall, Marines were choosing sides, placing bets, preparing for what promised to be either the most entertaining or most embarrassing 5 minutes in recent base history. "You know what?" Elena said, sitting back down at her table with fluid grace that spoke of perfect body control. "I'm good. You've already demonstrated everything I needed to know about your judgment, your training, and your fitness for leadership. Thanks for the data point." She picked up her pen and returned to her notebook, apparently dismissing the entire encounter as beneath her notice. It was the perfect psychological manipulation, offering Huxley a face-saving exit while simultaneously demonstrating her complete lack of concern about his capacity for violence. Huxley stood there for a long moment, fists clenched, breathing hard, every muscle in his body screaming for action, while his brain slowly processed the tactical situation. He could walk away, accept the implied insult, and preserve what remained of his dignity, or he could escalate further and risk discovering exactly how badly he'd misjudged the quiet woman in the corner. The entire mess hall held its breath, waiting to see which version of Garrett Huxley would emerge from this crucible, the smart one or the stupid one. Unfortunately for everyone involved, stupid won. His hand shot out toward her ponytail, fingers grasping for auburn hair, intending to jerk her head back and establish physical dominance through the kind of playground tactics that had worked for him since elementary school. It was pure instinct, pure ego, pure stupidity distilled into a single motion that would redefine everyone's understanding of the word mistake. What happened next would become legend whispered about in barracks and training facilities across the Corps, analyzed in professional development courses about the importance of situational awareness and the dangers of assumption. Corporal Garrett Huxley's fingers had barely grazed Elena's ponytail when the world exploded into motion and pain. What followed wasn't a fight. Fights implied some degree of mutual participation, a back-and-forth exchange where both parties had at least a theoretical chance of victory. This was a clinic, a masterclass in applied violence, delivered with the kind of surgical precision that turned human anatomy into a series of pressure points, leverage opportunities, and structural weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Elena's response was instantaneous and devastating. Her body uncoiled from the chair like a compressed spring, suddenly released, rotating counterclockwise as her right elbow drove backward into Huxley's solar plexus with piledriver force. The blow landed exactly where her anatomy textbook knowledge told her it would do maximum damage, just below the sternum, directly into the cluster of nerves that controlled his diaphragm. The air exploded from his lungs in a sound like a punctured tire, and his brain's autonomic systems went haywire, forgetting how to make his body breathe. He doubled over reflexively, hands moving to his midsection in a futile attempt to protect what was already compromised. But Elena wasn't finished with him. Not even close. As Huxley doubled over, gasping like a landed fish, Elena's left hand captured his wrist, the same hand that had grabbed for her hair, and applied a joint lock that turned his own momentum into a lever against his shoulder socket. The technique was called kimura in martial arts circles, though Elena had learned it in considerably less civilized circumstances from instructors who measured success in enemy casualties rather than tournament victories. The lock engaged with mechanical precision. Huxley's shoulder joint reached its maximum range of motion, then kept going, ligaments stretching past their design parameters. Pain shot down his arm like molten copper, white hot and all-consuming, and he tried to pull away, which only made everything worse. The more he struggled, the more pressure Elena applied, the more his shoulder joint protested its unnatural position. Elena controlled the pressure with surgical precision, enough to incapacitate, not quite enough to cause permanent damage. Professional courtesy, she supposed, though he'd done nothing to earn it. The human shoulder, Elena said conversationally, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the mess hall, is a remarkably complex joint. 26 separate muscles, 4 major ligament groups, and a range of motion that makes it incredibly versatile but structurally vulnerable. She adjusted her grip slightly, and Huxley made a sound like a wounded animal. His face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead, as his nervous system tried to process more pain than it was designed to handle. Around the mess hall, Marines sat frozen phones recording, witnessing something that would be analyzed and discussed and mythologized for years to come. For instance, Elena continued applying fractionally more pressure. If I rotate your arm just 3 degrees further in this direction, your shoulder dislocates. 6 degrees and the rotator cuff tears. 9 degrees and you're looking at reconstructive surgery and 18 months of physical therapy before you can even think about returning to active duty. Huxley tried to speak, managed only a strangled wheeze. His face was turning interesting colors as his respiratory system slowly remembered how to function. Elena held the lock for exactly 5 seconds, long enough to demonstrate complete control, not long enough to cause lasting damage, then released him with a casual motion that sent him stumbling backward into an empty chair. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Huxley's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the kitchen ventilation system. 37 Marines stared at the impossible scene before them, their unit's toughest fighter reduced to a gasping, sweating mess, by a woman who looked like she'd barely exerted herself. Staff Sergeant Kane's face had cycled through the entire spectrum of human emotion and settled somewhere between rage and disbelief. His world, the carefully constructed hierarchy where Marines sat at the apex of military evolution, was crumbling before his eyes, and he seemed powerless to stop it. "That's enough," he said, his voice cracking like a whip across the mess hall. "I don't know who you think you are, lady, but you just assaulted two of my Marines. That's a criminal offense. The military police are going to be very interested in hearing about this." Elena looked at him with the kind of patient tolerance usually reserved for particularly slow children struggling with basic concepts. "Sergeant, your Marine grabbed my hair without permission." "That's assault. I defended myself using appropriate force proportional to the threat." Everything that happened after that was his choice to escalate rather than disengage. She gestured toward Huxley, who was slowly regaining his ability to breathe normally, but still looked like he'd been hit by a truck. "I gave him multiple opportunities to walk away. I offered clear verbal warnings. He chose violence. I simply responded more efficiently than he expected." Kane's hands were clenched into fists, his jaw working like he was chewing nails. Around him, his Marines were beginning to murmur among themselves, phones buzzing with messages as word spread through the base's social networks at the speed of digital light. This was going viral, and everyone knew it. "You think this is funny?" Kane snarled, taking a step closer to Elena with the kind of aggressive posture that was meant to intimidate. "You think you can come into my mess hall, assault my Marines, and walk away like nothing happened?" "Your mess hall?" Elena's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication she found his presumption interesting. "That's fascinating, Sergeant. I was under the impression this was a United States Marine Corps facility open to all authorized personnel. When did it become your personal kingdom?" The question hit its target with sniper rifle precision. Kane's face flushed red above his collar, and Elena could see the moment his rational mind yielded completely to his emotional need for dominance. This was what she'd been waiting for, the point where professional training gave way to personal ego, where a leader revealed whether he was actually best to lead or just good at intimidating subordinates. "You want to know whose kingdom this is?" Kane stepped closer, using his height and bulk as weapons of intimidation, trying to make her feel small and vulnerable through sheer physical presence. "Let me explain how things work around here. This is Bravo Company. These are my Marines, and you..." He pointed a thick finger at her face close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the bloodshot whites of his eyes. "You're nobody. A civilian contractor, maybe. A Pentagon desk jockey, probably. Some admiral's diversity hire who thinks a weekend self-defense class makes her a warrior. But you're about to learn what happens when you disrespect real Marines in their own house." Elena didn't react to the finger in her face, didn't step back, didn't show any of the submissive body language that Keynes' psychology demanded. She just looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to see right through his bluster to the insecure man beneath. "You're right about one thing, Sergeant," she said quietly, and something in her tone made every Marine in the room lean forward to hear better. "I am nobody, just someone trying to eat dinner in peace before I brief your commanding officer on inter-service cooperation protocols." The mention of the commanding officer should have been a warning, a signal that she had official business and authority to be there. Instead, it seemed to inflame Kane's paranoia further. In his mind, she was probably there to spy on them, to find fault with their operations, to threaten the little empire he'd built through years of intimidation and politics. "Brief the CO about what?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, the kind that made smart Marines find somewhere else to be. "About how my Marines need sensitivity training, about how we're all sexist pigs who can't handle strong women, about how the Corps needs to lower its standards to accommodate people who can't hack it." Around the mess hall, conversations had stopped completely. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to watch the confrontation, sensing that something significant was happening. Marines pulled out phones, started recording, understanding that whatever happened next would be preserved, forever dissected and analyzed and shared across every military social media platform in existence. Lance Corporal Wyatt Brennan found his voice first emboldened by his sergeant's obvious anger. "Ma'am, maybe you should just leave. This doesn't have to get any worse than it already is. If you go now, maybe we can all forget this happened and move on." Lena turned to look at him, and Brennan felt a chill run down his spine. Those eyes were absolutely cold, the kind of empty calm that predators wore just before they struck. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. "Worst Corporal, you think this is bad?" She gestured around the mess hall at the Marines recording with their phones at Huxley, still gasping in his chair, at the scene of institutional dysfunction playing out under fluorescent lights. "This is just a conversation between professionals, a learning opportunity." She stood up from her table, moving with that same fluid grace that had characterized everything she'd done since walking into their world. The motion was simple, unthreatening, but something about it made every Marine in the room tense up as if a switch had been thrown. "See, here's what I think happened," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I think you boys got comfortable. You've been operating in your little bubble playing soldier, convincing yourselves that you're warriors because you've got the uniforms and the attitude and the swagger." She took a step toward Kane, who, despite being 6 inches taller and 60 pounds heavier, actually took a half step back before catching himself. "But warriors aren't made in mess halls, Sergeant. They're made in places where mistakes cost lives, where hesitation means death, where your assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't become irrelevant really quickly when the bullets start flying." Her smile was winter cold, carrying no warmth whatsoever. "You want to know who I am? You want to know why I'm here? Fine. But understand that once this conversation moves to its logical conclusion, there's no going back. Your comfortable little world where you're the apex predators that ends tonight." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Kane could back down, apologize for the misunderstanding, except that maybe he'd misjudged the situation entirely. Or he could double down on his authority, his pride, his absolute certainty that Marines were superior to everyone else in the military hierarchy. Looking at his face, Elena could see which choice he was going to make. It was written in the set of his jaw, the flush of his cheeks, the way his hands had curled into fists. He was going to choose pride over prudence, ego over intelligence. Poor bastard had no idea what he was walking into. "You think you can threaten me?" Kane's voice was rising now, his control finally slipping completely away like sand through his fingers. "You think you can come into my house and disrespect my Marines and walk away like you own the place?" Elena's response was delivered with the kind of calm certainty that made smart people nervous and stupid people furious. "Sergeant, I don't think I can do anything. I know exactly what I can do. The question is whether you're smart enough to avoid finding out firsthand." The gauntlet was down, the lines were drawn, and Corporal Garrett Huxley, still aching from his first lesson in humility, was about to watch his sergeant make the same mistake he had, assuming that confidence without competence was enough to win the day. But before Kane could respond, before he could make the choice that would seal his fate and the fate of his entire unit, Elena pulled a slim leather wallet from her pocket. She opened it with deliberate precision and held it out where everyone could see. The identification card inside bore official seals, clearance levels, that made Kane's secret clearance look like a library card in a photograph that left no doubt about her identity. "Commander Elena Hayes, SEAL Team 5, Naval Special Warfare Command, currently conducting classified assessment of inter-service cooperation protocols and unit readiness for joint operations." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that followed explosions when the human ear was temporarily deafened and the world seemed to exist in perfect crystalline stillness. 37 Marines stared at the identification card with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or car accidents. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane's face went through a transformation that would have been comical if the implications weren't so catastrophic. His ruddy complexion drained to the color of old parchment. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His eyes developed the 1,000-yard stare of a man watching his career evaporate in real time. "Commander," he whispered, and the word came out like a prayer from a condemned man. "That's correct, Sergeant." Elena's voice remained level professional, completely devoid of the satisfaction that lesser people might have shown at such a moment. "And for the past 43 minutes, I've been observing and documenting the behavior, discipline, and professional conduct of Bravo Company." She looked around the room, making eye contact with Marines who suddenly couldn't bear to meet her gaze. Phones disappeared into pockets with lightning speed as the full scope of their situation became clear. Corporal Huxley, she continued, her attention shifting to the man who'd started this entire catastrophe: assault on a superior officer, failure to verify identity before engaging, multiple violations of professional conduct standards. Huxley looked like he was going to be sick. His face had gone gray, and he was clutching his injured arm like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. Lance Corporal Brennan, Private First Class Thornton. Elena's gaze swept across the younger Marines who'd been so eager to record and mock, recording and distributing unauthorized video of classified personnel without proper security protocols. Potential violations of operational security that could compromise ongoing missions. Both men looked like they wanted to disappear entirely, to somehow phase through the floor and emerge somewhere far away where their careers might still be salvageable. And Staff Sergeant Kane, Elena's attention returned to the man who'd orchestrated this disaster through his negligence and toxic leadership. Failure to maintain unit discipline, failure to verify credentials of visiting personnel, creating a hostile environment for inter-service cooperation, threatening behavior towards superior officers. She closed her identification wallet and returned it to her pocket with careful precision. The assessment period is now concluded. I have more than sufficient documentation to complete my report to Naval Special Warfare Command and Marine Corps leadership. The implications hung in the air like toxic smoke. Everyone in the room understood what this meant: career-ending disciplinary action, courts, martial, dishonorable discharges. Years of military service training and advancement destroyed by 43 minutes of spectacular stupidity. But Elena wasn't finished with them yet. However, she said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else she'd spoken, creating a tiny spark of hope in the darkness of their despair. Assessments can be amended depending on how the remaining evaluation period proceeds. A spark of desperate hope flickered in Kane's eyes, fragile as candlelight in a storm. Ma'am, if there's anything we can do to— There is, Elena cut him off, her voice brooking no argument. But it's going to require something that hasn't been much in evidence tonight. It's going to require you to listen, to learn, and to demonstrate that maybe, just maybe, you're capable of growing beyond your current limitations. She gestured toward the empty chairs around her table, her meaning clear. Sit down, Sergeant. All of you. It's time for the real lesson to begin. And as 37 Marines slowly, reluctantly took seats around the woman they'd tried to intimidate, none of them had any idea that the hardest part of their education was still to come. The transformation that swept through mess hall, Charlie, was both immediate and profound, like watching a pack of wolves suddenly realize they were in the presence of an apex predator. 37 Marines who moments before had been confident in their superiority now moved with the careful deliberation of men walking through a minefield, every gesture calculated to avoid further catastrophe. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane lowered himself into the chair across from Elena with the kind of rigid precision usually reserved for funeral ceremonies. His face had settled into a mask of professional neutrality, but she could see the panic flickering behind his eyes. The other Marines followed suit, creating a rough semicircle around her table. Corporal Huxley moved gingerly, still favoring his injured arm. Lance Corporal Brennan kept his hands carefully visible. Private First Class Thornton looked like he was attending his own court-martial. Elena let the silence stretch for exactly 30 seconds, watching their body language, cataloging the subtle tells that revealed their psychological states. Fear was good. Fear meant they were finally taking the situation seriously, but fear alone wasn't enough. Gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying the authority that came from a decade of leading men into combat, we need to establish ground rules for the remainder of this evaluation. She pulled out her notebook, the same one Huxley had dismissed as unimportant 43 minutes ago. Now it looked like the most dangerous document in the room. First rule, honesty. I'm going to ask questions, and you're going to answer them truthfully. Not what you think I want to hear, but the actual truth. Deception at this point would be inadvisable. Kane nodded rapidly. Yes, ma'am, understood. Second rule, respect. Not for me personally, but for the process. This is a professional evaluation being conducted by a superior officer. Third rule, learning. What happened here tonight wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of institutional failures that go much deeper than individual personality conflicts. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. So let's start with the obvious question, Staff Sergeant Kane. When an unidentified individual enters your mess hall, what's the standard protocol? Kane's military training kicked in automatically. Verification of identification and purpose, ma'am. Challenge credentials. Escort to appropriate personnel if necessary. And what did you actually do? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Kane's jaw worked as he searched for an answer that wouldn't sound like complete admission of incompetence. We made assumptions, ma'am, based on appearance and preconceived notions about who belonged in our facility. Assumptions. Elena wrote something in her notebook. What kind of assumptions specifically? Kane's face flushed as he realized there was no acceptable way to answer without acknowledging the sexism that had driven their behavior. Ma'am, we assumed you were civilian personnel, a contractor, maybe a liaison, someone without operational authority. Why? The single word hit like a sniper's bullet. Direct, precise, impossible to dodge. Because we don't typically see female personnel in our operational areas. We made judgments based on incomplete information. Elena's pen moved across the page with mechanical precision. Corporal Huxley, walk me through your decision-making process. A woman enters your mess hall, sits alone, minds her own business. What made you think physical contact was appropriate? Huxley squirmed in his chair. Ma'am, I thought she needed to understand her place. The hierarchy. I was trying to establish dominance. Dominance, Elena finished for him. You were establishing dominance over someone you perceived as weak, and therefore fair game for intimidation. The words hung in the air like a guilty verdict. Around the table, several Marines shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own complicity in the culture that had created this moment. Here's what I see when I look at this unit, Elena said, her voice cutting through their discomfort like a blade. I see institutionalized arrogance. I see men so convinced of their own superiority that you've stopped questioning your assumptions, stopped verifying your intelligence, stopped following basic military protocols. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each man in turn. In a combat environment, that kind of thinking gets people killed. You see someone you don't recognize, you must assume they're not a threat because they don't fit your preconceived notions. You fail to establish identity, fail to assess capabilities, fail to maintain situational awareness. Her pen moved across the page again. 6 months ago, a Marine patrol in Somalia made similar assumptions. They got sloppy with their protocols. The room went completely quiet. Everyone knew where this story was heading. The operation went sideways, Elena continued, and something in her voice had changed, become harder and colder. Bad intelligence based on assumptions rather than verification. A compound that was supposed to have one target and minimal security turned out to have 12 hostiles and enough ordnance to level a city block. The silence that followed was deafening. That operation killed 3 Navy SEALs, Elena said, and now her voice carried an edge that made everyone at the table flinch. One of them was Lieutenant David Ramirez, my best friend since basic underwater demolition training. Another was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb. The third was Petty Officer First Class Sarah Chen, who had a husband and a 4-year-old daughter. She let that sink in for a moment, watching the realization spread across their faces like a stain. They died because Marines couldn't be bothered to verify their intelligence, because someone decided they knew better, because institutional arrogance overrode professional discipline. The same culture I'm seeing here tonight. Kane's voice was barely above a whisper. Ma'am, we had no idea. No, you didn't. Because you were too busy playing king of your little castle. Elena closed her notebook with deliberate finality. So here's where we stand. I have documented evidence of multiple serious violations of military protocol and professional conduct. Under normal circumstances, this would result in immediate disciplinary action, potential courts-martial and career-ending consequences for everyone involved. She let that sink in, watching the fear play across their faces. However, she continued, and that single word carried more weight than anything else she'd said, I'm prepared to consider this a learning opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter. But that consideration depends entirely on what happens next. Kane leaned forward, desperation obvious in his voice. Ma'am, what do you need from us? How can we make this right? Elena's smile was cold, but not entirely without mercy. You can start by proving that you're capable of learning from this experience. that you understand the fundamental failures that led to this situation. She stood up, and every Marine in the room tensed reflexively. Tomorrow morning, 0500 hours, we're going to conduct a practical exercise. A test of your unit's actual capabilities versus your assumed superiority. You're going to have the opportunity to demonstrate whether tonight was an aberration or a symptom of deeper problems. Her gaze swept across the assembled Marines like a searchlight. I suggest you use the intervening hours wisely. Study your manuals, review your protocols, and think very carefully about the assumptions that brought you to this moment. She gathered her things with practiced efficiency. Oh, and gentlemen, she paused at the edge of their circle. Tomorrow's exercise will be evaluated by your commanding officer, your executive officer, and a representative from Marine Corps leadership. Your performance will determine not just your individual futures, but the future of this entire unit. The weight of those words settled over them like a death sentence. Get some rest, Elena said, though they all knew sleep would be impossible. You're going to need it. With that, she walked away, leaving 37 Marines to contemplate the wreckage of their evening and wonder if they had any future left to salvage. The pre-dawn darkness at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton carried a different quality than the oppressive tension of the previous evening. At 0445 hours 37, Marines stood in formation on the parade ground, their breath visible in the morning chill, their futures hanging in the balance of whatever Commander Elena Hayes had planned for them. Kane had spent the night making discreet inquiries about Commander Hayes. The fragments he'd managed to piece together painted a picture of someone who operated at levels so far above his experience that comparison was meaningless. Operation Neptune's Wrath in Libya, where she'd eliminated 8 high-value targets solo. The Kandahar extraction, where she'd pulled a downed pilot through 40 hostiles without a single friendly casualty. And Somalia, where she'd personally led the recovery operation for her fallen teammates. The formation was perfect now, spacing exact uniforms, immaculate weapons clean and ready. They'd spent 2 hours preparing, driven by desperate hope that maybe perfect execution of basic military standards might demonstrate their fitness for continued existence. At precisely 0500 hours, 3 vehicles approached the parade ground. The first sedan disgorged Colonel James Bradford and Major Patricia Vance. The second produced Brigadier General Victor Stone from Marine Corps headquarters at Quantico. Stone was 62 years old with gray hair and the bearing of a man who'd seen everything and been impressed by very little. His presence indicated just how seriously the chain of command was taking this evaluation. But it was the third vehicle that commanded everyone's attention. Elena Hayes emerged from the modified Humvee wearing full combat gear that looked like it had seen actual use. Her equipment was functional, well-maintained, configured with the attention to detail that marked someone who understood that gear failures in the field meant death. Colonel Bradford's voice carried across the parade ground with the authority of absolute command. Gentlemen, you are about to participate in a practical evaluation designed to assess your unit's operational readiness and professional competence. This evaluation will be conducted by Commander Hayes, observed by General Stone, and documented for review by Marine Corps leadership. He paused, letting the implications sink in. The scenario is simple. Commander Hayes represents a high-value target located in hostile territory. Your mission is to capture or neutralize this target using appropriate tactics and procedures. Elena stepped forward. Rules of engagement: I will be armed with simulation rounds and defensive equipment only. You will have full access to your combat loadout, including simulated weapons communications and support assets. The exercise area encompasses the entire training facility, approximately 4 square kilometers of varied terrain. She looked directly at Kane. You have 15 minutes to plan your operation, organize your forces, and begin execution. I will give you a 5-minute head start before beginning evasion. Your objective is to locate, fix, and capture the target within 2 hours. General Stone stepped forward, his expression granite hard. Understand this, Marines. This is not a game. This is not a training exercise where everyone gets participation trophies. This is a practical demonstration of your capabilities, measured against genuine special operations standards. He gestured toward the observation post. Your performance will be monitored, recorded, and analyzed by personnel with actual combat experience in similar operations. There will be no do-overs, no second chances, no excuses. What happens in the next 2 hours will determine whether Bravo Company continues to exist or becomes a footnote in Marine Corps history. Elena checked her watch. 15 minutes, Marines, use them wisely. Kane spread a topographic map on the hood of the nearest vehicle. All right, listen up. We're hunting a SEAL commander with unknown capabilities in 4 square kilometers. She knows we're coming. She's had time to plan, and she's already demonstrated that our assumptions about her are worthless. Huxley leaned over the map despite his injured arm. Sarge, she's one person. We're 37. The numbers have to count for something. The numbers, Kane said grimly, didn't help when she took you apart last night. He looked around at his squad leaders. We need to think like hunters, not like bullies. We need to use our advantages, communications coordination, local knowledge, while minimizing our exposure to hers. Brennan spoke up. What are her advantages, Sarge? Kane studied the map. Superior individual skills, better environmental awareness, and extensive experience in evasion and escape. She'll use the terrain, create multiple fallback positions, probably try to isolate us into smaller groups where she can engage on favorable terms. He began marking positions with swift strokes. We're going to set up overlapping search grids, maintain constant communication, and move in mutually supporting elements. No one operates alone, no one breaks radio protocol, and no one engages without backup. The plan that emerged was actually competent, a testament to the training and experience that had made Bravo Company a respected unit. Coordinated sweeps, overwatch positions, communication protocols that would prevent the kind of isolation tactics that special operators specialized in. But what none of them realized was that they were planning in full view of Building 12's third-floor windows 300 meters away, where Elena Hayes was watching through a spotting scope and listening to their radio frequencies. As they finalized their plan, Kane's radio crackled to life on his private frequency. Check your sixth, Sergeant. Kane spun around, weapon coming up, searching for the threat. There was nothing, just empty parade ground and distant buildings. Elena's voice came again, calm and professional. Your rally points are compromised. Your cache locations are known. Your communications frequencies are mapped. I've been on this base for 72 hours, not 3. I know every inch you think you own. The psychological impact was devastating. Every advantage they thought they possessed had been an illusion. You have 5 minutes, Elena continued. I suggest you use it differently than planned. The Marines deployed to their pre-planned positions, but the confidence had drained from their movements. For the first 30 minutes, Elena simply vanished. No thermal signature, no radio emissions, no physical evidence of passage. She'd become a ghost. Private Harrison reported movement at Building 7 second floor. Huxley's Alpha team converged with professional precision. The building was empty except for a single brass casing deliberately placed on the windowsill. Engraved on it, 1 of 37. Brennan analyzed it with growing dread. She's counting us like targets. 20 minutes later came another report. Building 3 movement in the southwest window. Bravo team moved to investigate. Again, the building was empty. But this time they found something that made their blood run cold. A mirror array positioned to catch sunlight and create the illusion of motion from 200 meters away. A note was taped beside it. Sun angle 43 degrees, reflection distance 200 mm, basic optics. EH. 30 minutes into the exercise, Brennan's communications suddenly went dead. Primary frequency white noise. Secondary backup jammed. Emergency tertiary channel crackled to life with Elena's voice. This is your target. Your comms are my comms now. Charlie team reached their rally point at the abandoned motor pool where they'd cached equipment the night before. What they found made their tactical situation crystal clear. Every piece of equipment had been moved. Not stolen or destroyed, but rearranged in a perfect geometric pattern. Weapons field stripped and sorted. Ammunition organized by caliber and manufacture date. The note left on their radio read, OPSEC failure number 1, visible planning. 2, predictable caches. Number 3, assuming home field advantage. You have 90 minutes remaining. Kane made his fatal error. Desperate and frustrated, he ordered all teams to converge on Grid Square, Tango 7 high ground, with excellent visibility. It was perfect defensive doctrine. It was also exactly what Elena had been waiting for. As 37 Marines took position on the high ground, establishing overlapping fields of fire and interlocking security, Elena's voice crackled across their radios one more time. Textbook positioning, perfect conventional tactics. Unfortunately, you're not facing a conventional threat. You're not in a defensive position, Marines. You're in a kill box I designed in. The smoke grenade landed in the center of their position from an angle no one was watching. White phosphorus turned their perfect visibility into zero visibility in 4 seconds. Marines went prone, established security perimeters, tried to maintain unit cohesion, despite complete loss of visual reference. What happened next was systematic dismantling. Brennan disappeared first, Elena appearing beside him like a ghost in the smoke. Nerve cluster, strike to the brachial plexus, 8 seconds from contact to cable tie restraints. His radio went dead mid-transmission. A paired position on the perimeter heard a rock thrown to their left. They separated by 15 meters to investigate. Elena eliminated each within 22 seconds, each man thinking his partner was still operational. Huxley had learned something from the previous night. He'd taken a non-standard position, maintained irregular movement patterns. He lasted 3 minutes before Elena found him. This time she used a different technique, a compliance hold instead of the nerve strike from the mess hall. "Better, Corporal?" Her voice came over the radio for everyone to hear. "You're learning." The smoke began to clear. Marines were reforming, trying to account for personnel. 7 were gone. 7 more in the next 6 minutes as Elena moved through their formation like a scalpel through tissue, demonstrating close quarters, combat pressure, point manipulation, joint locks, psychological dominance. Private Thornton found himself separated from his unit in the chaos. And he did something unexpected. Instead of following doctrine and trying to link up with friendly forces, he stopped. He thought like an insurgent, like the enemy. He moved toward the chaos instead of away, hiding in a position Elena had already cleared, waiting in ambush instead of searching. For 12 minutes, he evaded the finest SEAL operator most of them would ever encounter. Finally, Elena detected him through a displaced dust pattern on the floor where he'd shifted position. But instead of simply eliminating him, she keyed her radio to broadcast to all remaining Marines. Private Thornton lasted 12 minutes. Know why he stopped thinking like a Marine, started thinking like an operator? He used terrain patience enemy behavior analysis. He adapted. The rest of you repeated failures. If a 22-year-old private can evolve, what's your excuse? The psychological impact on the remaining Marines was profound. Their youngest member had outperformed their seniors by abandoning everything they'd taught him. 17 Marines remained when Elena's voice came across the radio one final time. "Exercise terminated. Weapons safe. I eliminated 20 operators using minimal force, 0 injuries. Could have been lethal 47 times. Chose education. That's the difference between killing and teaching." From the observation post, General Stone turned to Colonel Bradford. "She just demonstrated why SEALs exist. Not because they're better warriors, because they think differently. Question is, can Marines learn that?" The 37 Marines of Bravo Company reformed on the parade ground. Equipment was recovered, simulated casualties rejoined their units, but something essential had changed. The arrogance had been systematically extracted and replaced with something harder to define, but infinitely more valuable: respect for genuine competence. Elena stood before them and removed her helmet. "Before we discuss performance, you need context." She pulled out a folder, classification markings visible. 6 months ago, SEAL Team 5 conducted a joint operation with Marine Force Recon in Somalia. The mission brief said 1 target, minimal security. Reality was 12 hostiles, a weapons cache, prepared ambush. Lieutenant Ramirez died in the doorway. Chief Webb and Petty Officer Chen died in the compound. The investigation revealed Force Recon intel was based on assumptions, not verification. She looked at Kane. "That operation killed my friends because of the same institutional arrogance I witnessed last night. My mission here wasn't just evaluation, it was determination." She held up the folder. "These are orders authorizing me to recommend Force Recon Bravo Company for dissolution. Your performance today was supposed to decide which recommendation I make." The weight of those words hit like physical blows. Not just careers, but the entire unit's existence had been on the line. "However," Elena continued, "you've demonstrated something today. Not competence, you failed spectacularly, but capacity for learning." Kane stood removed, his rank insignia came to attention. "Ma'am, we failed every test you set. Security protocols, tactical assumptions, professional conduct. But the worst failure was we didn't see you as an operator. We saw you as an obstacle. That thinking killed your friends and nearly destroyed our unit. I formally request give us a chance to prove we can change. Huxley stepped forward. Commander, I grabbed you because I thought I could. Thought gender meant weakness. You taught me assumptions are tactical failures. I request permission to learn actual combat techniques versus bullying tactics. One by one, each Marine stepped forward with specific acknowledgments. Not generic apologies, but precise technical admissions of failure. General Stone stepped forward. Commander Hayes' permission to address the formation. Elena nodded, respect between peers evident. 1983 Beirut barracks bombing. Stone said, his voice carrying 6 decades of hard-earned wisdom. I was a young lieutenant with 2nd Battalion. We assumed we knew everything about force protection. Lost 241 Marines because we ignored intel from sources we deemed unreliable. Spent 30 years learning that humility isn't weakness, it's survival. He looked at the assembled Marines. These men failed today. So did I in Beirut. Difference is I got men killed. Commander Hayes gave you a learning opportunity. He turned to Elena. I recommend 72-hour intensive integration training. My observation, this unit has capacity for change if properly guided. But the decision is yours. You earned that right in Somalia. Elena studied each Marine for a long moment. General, I concur with your recommendation. Conditional on zero tolerance for repeat failures. What followed were 3 days that would transform Bravo Company forever. Day 1 began at 0500 with close quarters combat. Elena demonstrated each elimination technique, from the exercise breaking down physics, anatomy, psychology, timing. Huxley practiced the nerve strike 73 times before executing it correctly. Competence isn't talent, Elena told him. It's repetition past the failure point. Day 2 brought joint operations. Bravo Company ran a compound assault with SEAL Team 5. The first attempt failed because Marines deferred too much, treating SEALs as superiors rather than partners. Elena stopped the exercise. Partnership means equals, not subordinates. The second attempt succeeded in 23 minutes, perfect coordination between complementary capabilities. Day 3 was the final test capture. Elena again, same parameters. This time, Marines challenged her credentials immediately upon contact. They used unconventional movement patterns learned from Thornton. They implemented counter-surveillance, eliminating the Building 12 observation point. They achieved communications security through frequency hopping protocols. First contact came at 18 minutes instead of 47. Successful capture at 1 hour, 4 minutes. You adapted, Elena told them. You questioned assumptions. You collaborated. You didn't beat me through superior force. You beat me through superior thinking. That's what makes operators not invincibility, but adaptability. In Colonel Bradford's office, Elena presented her 47-page assessment. Force Recon Bravo Company not recommended for dissolution. Conditional approval pending quarterly joint training and ongoing cultural audit. Rationale demonstrated capacity for rapid institutional learning. General Stone endorsed it. These Marines transformed in 72 hours. That's rare. I recommend Bravo Company becomes the model for inter-service integration. 3 months later, the changes were visible throughout Camp Pendleton. Mess Hall Charlie operated with integrated seating. Training protocols combined conventional and special operations tactics. New recruits arrived saying, "You're going to Bravo Company." That's the unit that trains with SEALs. Kane was teaching assumption management at Quantico. Huxley had been selected for SEAL screening and passed Phase 1. Brennan's new communications protocol had been adopted by Joint Special Operations Command. Thornton had been promoted to sergeant ahead of schedule. The morning Bravo Company deployed on their first joint operation. Elena arrived unannounced in dress blues. General Stone was with her. Couldn't miss this, Stone said. Bravo Company's first joint deployment as a certified Tier 1 integration unit. Elena addressed the formation and their families. 3 months ago, I evaluated you for elimination. Today, you're deploying as one of the Marine Corps' finest, not because you never failed, because you learned from failure. Kane approached her privately. Thank you for not destroying us, ma'am. I didn't save you, Sergeant. You saved yourselves. Somalia taught me that failure only kills if you don't learn from it. We'll honor Lieutenant Ramirez's memory. Every operation has lessons. Elena's voice was tight with emotion. That's all I wanted. Make their deaths mean something. As 6 months after deployment, Bravo Company returned with zero casualties and perfect mission success. In one operation, Kane's unit had saved a SEAL team caught in an ambush, roles reversed from Somalia. The Marine Corps adopted the Hayes Protocol as standard training at basic school and officer candidate school. At General Stone's retirement ceremony after 40 years of service, he asked Elena to present. In his speech, he said, "The best operators I've known had one quality they taught while they fought. Privately, he told her, 'You taught me something. I thought warfare was about destroying enemies. You showed me it's about creating allies.' Bravo Company isn't just better Marines, they're ambassadors." Months later, Elena received new orders. Another base, another toxic unit requiring evaluation. As she entered their mess hall without rank insignia and sat alone with her notebook, a Marine corporal stood and began walking toward her. Elena's small smile carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Let's see if you're smarter than the last unit." The cycle would continue, not because the military was broken, but because excellence required constant vigilance, constant teaching, constant willingness to tear down what was broken and rebuild it better. Commander Elena Hayes had learned that lesson in the blood-soaked doorway of a Mogadishu compound. Now she would spend the rest of her career ensuring that lesson lived on one transformed unit at a time. The best leaders didn't just win battles. They created more leaders. They turned failure into wisdom, arrogance into humility, assumption into verification. They left every place better than they found it, even if it meant tearing it down first. That was the legacy of the mess hall reckoning written in the transformed lives of 37 Marines who'd learned that true strength came not from never falling, but from rising stronger every time.